The Byte Show is listener-supported at thebyteshow.com. Follow us on Twitter at The Byte Show.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And we have a very exciting show tonight with Joseph P. Farrell. And you can email Joseph Farrell at Vardas, and that's V as in Victor, A-R-D as in David, A-S, then the numeral 3 at AOL.com. His website is GizaDeathStar.com. And Joseph is a brilliantly gifted researcher and a prolific author. He holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford. He has published 4 previous works, all on theology. He recently moved back to his home state of South Dakota, where he pursues research on his other loves and hobbies, such as classical music. He is an organist. He plays the harpsichord. And Joseph is a composer of classical music. And I'm not talking about a cut, copy, paste, modern-day type composer. I mean, he is a real composer. He is also deeply involved in physics, alternative history, and science, and what people out that are inside the box would call really strange stuff. Correct, right?
Yes, that's quite true.
I knew I'd get you with that one. And I have Joseph's books listed on his special page at The Byte Show. And tonight, when we upload, there will be information how people can get a hold of Adventures Unlimited Press, their 24-hour order line. And you can order there with a credit card or get other information. Joseph's books here that I have listed, the first one is Giza Death Star. The second one is the Giza Death Star Deployed. The third one in that trilogy is the Giza Death Star Destroyed. And then we have the book on Nazi secret weapons, Reich of the Black Sun and the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. Also, the Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics, and Ancient Texts. And whoa. And tonight begins part 4 in our series, Cosmic War. And gosh, Joseph. I kind of look at our planet as being somewhat like a Faraday cage, if you will. And some people have said that the rotation of the Earth at some point will wobble, stop, and spin the other way. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I know there's lots of theories out there, some much more serious than others, concerning pole shifts and crustal displacements. The famous alternative researcher and scientist Hapgood, in fact, wrote a book about pole shift, and unusually, it actually was prefaced by Dr. Albert Einstein. So, this shows us that, there are some very serious people involved in this and some just quite downright flaky ones as well. I don't really investigate these things because, notwithstanding Einstein's endorsement of Hapgood's crustal displacement idea, I don't see myself the physics for it, nor how it would be possible for the entire planet to quit moving and then start rotating in another direction. There's just no good model for that, nor to explain what might happen if that were actually to occur. So I don't delve into any of those theories. I kind of lump them in the same broad category that I call catastrophism in the Cosmic War and some of my other books on the Great Pyramid. These schools of thought really kind of predominate today within alternative history and science research as a method of explaining or interpreting ancient texts. And my approach, I think, ultimately is truer to what those texts themselves say, in that they all give indications of two very clear things, and the first is the existence of an extremely sophisticated physics with a commensurate technology based upon it, and the second is the use of that technology in its weaponization form to create massive destruction in a very, very ancient cosmic war that I believe the textual indicators state, and very clearly so, was fought within our own solar system, within our local celestial neighborhood. So I examine texts from that point of view rather than from the catastrophist point of view. And I should stress that my philosophical objection to catastrophism really doesn't come out very clearly until the book The Cosmic War. And in it I state that there are kind of two schools within most alternative research. One is the school that I just outlined, and to me it's nothing but a variation of philosophical materialism. There is a clear-cut agenda at work in many of these people, and largely it's simply an assault on religion of any form. The second school I call the Disneyland jonquils and daisies approach, because that approach wants to see in all of this ancient technology, which very clearly existed, that wants to see in it nothing but a kind of a fairyland of goodness and peace and virtue and so on and so forth, that is bereft of nasty bad things like cosmic wars and weapons of mass destruction and everything else that goes with it.
Well, looking in retrospect, what would be our very first indicator of a cosmic war?
Well, there are essentially two classes of evidence one has to look at. The first is what I call textual, and I use the term text in a very, very broad sense, as meaning not only books or tablets or writings of some sort, but also monuments such as the Great Pyramid or Baalbek in Lebanon and so forth. Because to a certain extent those things are text. They are telling a story, but the way to decipher them is through the methods of science, and in particularly physics, because the physics involved in simply constructing those things is quite interesting, the engineering problems that they pose and so on and so forth. So there's a certain amount of decoding that one has to take to these things, I think, and to the texts themselves. So you look first of all for what they say. And in the pyramid books, essentially what I'm doing is outlining a kind of a prima facie circumstantial case based on some scientific speculation about the structure of the Great Pyramid in particular that seems to suggest that it embodies a physics that would have rendered it or made it possible to be some sort of ancient weapon of mass destruction. And the texts themselves indicate from, all over the world, but principally from Egypt and Sumeria and the Vedic texts and that area of the world, that these wars were fought with a commensurately sophisticated technology and physics. The other class of evidence that is a completely different sort of class of evidence that I take into consideration, beginning really with the second pyramid book, the Giza Death Star Destroyed, and then I continue this line of thought in the third pyramid book, which is the Giza Death Star Destroyed, and kind of flesh out the argument completely in the cosmic war. The other line of evidence concerns itself with extraterrestrial artifacts that would seem to indicate the presence of a very sophisticated technology and therefore civilization on our planetary neighbors eons ago, and also to the evidence that there once was an exploded planet in the solar system. And of course, we've discussed that in our previous sessions, and so I can restate the case very simply here, that there really is no good naturalistic physics model for why a planet should suddenly and spontaneously explode. And this ties into the ancient texts that indicate that this cosmic war was fought, and that specifically during the process a celestial body in our local neighborhood was destroyed. It was literally blown up. So I kind of put all of these things together in the four books that concern this subject. The two Nazi books kind of pick up the modern angle of the story, because I do believe that the Nazi books, or that the Nazis, were pursuing very deliberately and consciously the recovery of some aspects of this physics.
Toph's children.
Yes, to Huda's children, right.
Yes.
Exactly. Exactly so. Children of Atlantis.
Yeah. Children of the pre-flood world, actually. When you talk about gravity and things like that, do we have evidence that they can manipulate gravity?
Yes, we do.
Even today?
Oh, yes. Oh, definitely. The two Nazi books, and in particular the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, delve into what the Nazis classified as their most highly classified secret weapons project. And I need to put that into a context for your listeners.
Okay.
In the first book, which is called Reich of the Black Sun, and the subtitle kind of gives away the game, it's called Nazi Secret Weapons and the Cold War Allied Legend. And the legend is essentially this, that the Germans, while they may have invented most of the basic outlines of nuclear physics prior to World War II, that they ended up being nuclear engineering bunglers and incompetents during the war, and the finger is always pointed to the Nazi Party ideology and its proscriptions of relativity and so on and so forth as an area of investigation for German scientists. Well, on the face of it, this is patently absurd, because nuclear physics has very little to do with relativity theories other than Einstein's famous E=mc² equation. And if you dig in the literature long enough, you'll discover that that equation really wasn't even first conceived by Einstein. He just kind of put it in a very interesting cosmological context. So there really was nothing peculiar about it that belonged necessarily entirely and solely to Albert Einstein's genius. So that was the first clue. And then the second clue for me was that none of the Allied legend concerning the atomic bomb really made sense. And the real whopper that kind of exhibits this fact is that we never tested the uranium bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, this is just an absurd thing for the U.S. military to be doing. And you know, we're told by the standard histories that, well, we just knew it would work because our engineering principles were so sound. Well, it is true that particular bomb had a relatively simple method of assembling the critical mass. But be that as it may, what we're really doing is we're dropping a bomb on an enemy combatant's city in the middle of this total war, and that combatant, we also happen to know, is working on its own atomic bomb, and Japan was. And they were very good, you know, they knew the basic principles of what they had to do. So it wasn't a matter as if, you know, we were dealing with complete and total blockheads as far as nuclear physics was concerned by any means. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, this got me pursuing what may really have been the real story of the Nazi A-bomb, and I came to the conclusion in Reich of the Black Sun, based on a kind of a circumstantial prima facie case, that much of this history about the atom bomb needs to be completely rewritten, because I believe that the Nazis, if they did not explode some sort of nuclear device around October of 1944, they were close to within a hair's breadth of doing so by the end of the war. In other words, their A-bomb project was much, much further along than the picture that we have been led to believe by our history books after the war. Now, that's the context. Let's go to the Bell and to your question about gravity.
Right.
Within this context, this Bell project, the Nazis classified with its own absolutely unique classification in all of the Third Reich's quite extensive arsenal of very exotic secret weapons and technologies. The classification that they gave it was Kriegsentscheidend, which translates to war decisive. So in other words, this thing is classified much higher than what looks to be, for all intents and purposes, a successful atomic bomb project on their part. And the code names of the project are also very interesting. It has 3 different code names in the literature about it. The first is Project Kronos, which is a translation from the Greek word meaning time or Saturn, as in the planet. The second project code name is Tor, which is the German word for gate, like the Brandenburger Tor in Berlin, which everybody knows. So it's a project concerning a gate. The third code name is Das Laternenträger Projekt, which translates as the Lantern Bearer Project. And the Polish researcher Igor Witkowski points out that this is an indication that at least some aspect of the project was based in occult or esoteric considerations, because it's a loose metaphor for the light bearer or for Lucifer. Mm-hmm. So the Germans, when we examined this project and what was involved with it, the head of the project was Dr. Walter Gerlach, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who also, incidentally, by this time in history, was heading up their atomic bomb project. But his specialty was not actually nuclear physics. It was in things like magnetic spin, resonance, and gravitation. So, in other words, the Nazis were experimenting with a means of manipulating and controlling gravity. And from all indications about this project, they were very successful, and that's the scary part. Because, when, we look at the equations of general relativity, when we are manipulating gravity, by the nature of the case, we are also manipulating time, and by the nature of the case, therefore, the structure of space-time itself. So the Germans were playing around quite literally, and I mean this in the fullest sense of the word. I'm not resorting to hyperbole when I state this, that they were playing around with a literal doomsday physics, and there's our connection with all of this ancient stuff.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you can manipulate gravity, you can manipulate time. You can do, yes, it's a flexible physics and a flexible technology. You can invent field propulsion devices. You have a potentially limitless source of energy. You have the potential for weaponization that, and I've said this many times in these shows, that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. Right. So, yes, this is a physics that potentially is strong enough and powerful enough to accomplish something like the destruction of an entire planet. Well, it would, distortions in gravity. Another question here, wouldn't that also cause distortions in people's thinking? Well, yes, I think so, because, the Earth has its own natural
harmonic resonance. It's called the Schumann cavity resonance. It's about, I think 7.3 to 7.8 to 7.9 hertz. So it's a very low frequency, obviously. But the human brain is, as most brains of animals are, is in sync with that cavity resonance. It functions best in those frequencies. So when you change the geometry or the shape of any sort of local space-time, you're going to a certain extent, you're going to be creating a cavity resonance, as it were, and you'd better be very careful to make sure that it's going to be something commensurate with the natural Schumann cavity resonance of the Earth. So yes, I think that's definitely true.
And wouldn't they, or couldn't they possibly utilize this along with the mind control that we talked about last time, the geometry of it?
Well, one of the things I point out in the Cosmic War is that if one examines the ancient texts, the Sumerian texts, and some certain Egyptian texts carefully, one of the things that emerges is that these gods who are manipulating and using this technology for destructive purposes always have to be, or seem to have to be, in some close physical proximity or even contact with it. And that seems to imply, and I speculate a bit on this in one whole chapter in the Cosmic War, that seems to imply that there is some sort of aspect of the physics of consciousness that is involved in all of this technology. I don't go into much detail because that's really a rather emerging new area within physics, but nonetheless it's there, and you have to mention it. So yes, again, if we extrapolate and speculate a bit on the basis of the evidence that's there, I don't think it would be at all unusual that consciousness manipulation is an aspect of this. And in fact, in the Cosmic War, I point out one particular passage, I believe it's of an ancient Sumerian text, where it very clearly implies that some sort of manipulation of emotion or consciousness is occurring as a result of the employment of these weapons.
Wouldn't it be possible with this type of weaponry, Joseph, could they, is it conceivable that they could cause start experimenting with coronal mass ejections, discharges?
Oh yes, absolutely. One of the things about, and I believe we talked a bit in the last session about what some people call scalar physics and others want to call quantum potential physics, or any number of names. One of the effects of this is that any large, massive body, such as a planet or a star, is a natural resonator of these types of waves of stress in the fabric of space-time itself. So in other words, if you are not careful, and I cite this passage, I think, even in the Cosmic War itself, if you are not careful, one of the things that can happen to you is that natural resonance will in turn cause that particular celestial body to form a connection with whatever is producing the resonance, and it can, so to speak, burp. And in the case of the sun, if we're manipulating technologies and things of this sort, one of the things that possibly, and I emphasize that word, that possibly might result is that you create a charge differential between one celestial body and another. And in the case of the solar system, if it is an electrically dynamic system, as I believe it to be, then this might cause the sun to start having massive coronal ejections as these charge differentials arc quite literally from one point to another.
Right. Oh, boy. Very dangerous weapon.
Very, very. There's no two ways of slicing this. This is celestially scaled stuff.
Well, would you put that under the heading also of plasma?
Oh, yes, definitely. For your listeners to know, plasma physics, plasma cosmology physics, is actually the brainchild of a Nobel laureate Swedish physicist by the name of Hannes Alfvén. And it's a kind of an alternative cosmology that doesn't get much play in mainstream media, but it really is the main alternative mainstream cosmology within physics right now, as an alternative to the Big Bang relativity-based cosmologies that most of us are familiar with. And the reason why is that plasma physicists discovered that they could create within the laboratory, and also by means of computer simulation, they could create within the laboratory plasma discharge phenomena that take the same shape, the exact same shape, as galaxies. In other words, the whole basis of plasma cosmology is that the basic shape of galaxies themselves is an indicator that the principal controlling forces in the universe are not gravity, but electromagnetic. Now, the difficulty with plasma cosmology, and I mentioned this in The Cosmic War, is that we know from relativity that electromagnetic phenomena travel at the velocity of light. And in the case of plasma cosmology, we see clusters of entire galaxies kind of clumped together. And that the reason that they're clumped is that there exist these electrical plasma filaments that connect to them. In other words, the electromagnetic energy is binding them together, and yet we're dealing with structures in the universe that are billions of light years across. So in other words, the information cannot travel fast enough between these galaxies. And this is where hyperdimensional physics enters the picture. Because what that means then is that the connections that electromagnetism creates between galaxies is the signature of a much deeper physics that connects them, that is creating those connections. In other words, those connections are not the fundamental connection. They are merely the signature of something much, much deeper. And, you know, it's a story that's been emerging in physics for the last, I'd say, really since Riemann in the 19th century first kind of proposed these types of ideas. So it's a story that's really been going on for about 150 years, and various people have been involved in trying to connect the dots. We're still, I think, a long way off from having a sufficient theoretical edifice to explain all these connections, but we have some significant clues.
Well, with the sun, if they can, if they can cause and control certain frequencies coming out of the sun, that would certainly have an effect on the human DNA, the immune system,
everything,
everything on this planet that's living.
Right. Right. It is a cosmically scaled physics that we're dealing with. And, you know, I should stress one of the unique things about plasma cosmology is that it is unlike the relativistic and quantum mechanical alternatives, which, you know, relativity is the physics of the very large, and quantum mechanics is the physics of the very small. And physicists have been puzzling for decades now how to squeeze the two things together and make them work in a consistent, coherent, unified theoretical edifice. But in plasma cosmology, since we can produce plasma discharges in the laboratory on a very small scale that have exactly the same type of spiraling vorticular geometry as entire galaxies, we're really dealing with a physics that's scale invariant, and that is its big selling point to many physicists, because we're dealing with something very different from the standard cosmologies that we're used to thinking in terms of. So going back to your comment, because of this, when we consider the weaponization potential of it, just imagining, theoretically, for the sake of argument, that we weaponize this stuff, that means we can make it either very small or extraordinarily large. And again, that would imply a physics manipulating the celestial mechanics of entire planets and stars and so on and so forth. So it is a very, very frightening development to contemplate.
Yes. Some time ago, a few years ago, I read an article somewhere that, for example, the brain case itself, everybody's brain case has a identifier, a signature, if you will, kind of like a fingerprint.
Right.
And that cell phones are part of the identification process of getting everybody's brain case signature.
Right.
I mean, that's scary, Joseph.
Well, it's very scary. I lost a sister about 7 years ago to a malignant glioblastoma, and I am convinced that the reason that she got this brain cancer was that she used a mobile phone so much in her home to answer the phone, and the tumor occurred precisely on the side of her head where the antenna for the microwaves always was. I will not use a cell phone. I never have, for that precise reason, because I just don't fancy sticking my head into a microwave oven. Microwave.
I have one, for emergencies.
Right.
My son insists that I have one for that.
Sure.
But to carry on conversations, are you kidding?
No, I won't do it.
No. It is dangerous, and they're lying to us about that.
Right. Right.
It causes a lot of problems. There's also been articles lately that state that it actually serves to lower the IQ of young people.
Yeah, I would not be a bit surprised because, again, the brain functions precisely on firings of the neural pathways, and those are electrochemical processes. So it stands to reason that any time you're bombarding the brain with electromagnetic energy of a certain type, you're going to inhibit or interfere with those processes. So, it's just a very clear and logical and rational case, and I've never really understood those who can't see it.
Yeah, same here. There are none so blind as those who will not see.
That's right.
Well, in talking about this now, let's go back to some old history.
Sure.
The Templars.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, that came out of left field, but okay.
Those funny boys that ride double on a donkey?
Well, if we believe they're seals, yes.
Yeah. What about this group? Very interesting.
Well, one of the things I get into in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, and I think this is probably what you're referring to, is that if we look at the origin of esotericism itself, in other words, of secret societies and mystery schools and so on, and if we read what some of those societies themselves actually say in their texts about their origins, we run into a very interesting thing, and that is that, and this is particularly true the farther back we go, the interesting thing that they all mention is that they are connected somehow with the flood.
Yeah.
And with the destruction of that pre-existing very high civilization that was there prior to it. And one of the interesting things, and this is particularly true in the Masonic literature that I examine in that book, one of the things that comes out is that these societies were founded in part to preserve that previous society's knowledge and by implication, and it's even clearly stated in some of these texts, to recover the technology of that civilization. So in other words, what I believe happened was, and we'll get to the Templars here in a moment,
Okay.
what I believe happened was, in this ancient cosmic war, we have essentially the same scenario playing out as played out at the end of World War II, when certain high Nazi leadership realized that the war militarily was lost unless their secret weapons projects bore fruit in time. And, you know, being Germans, they planned for the worst, and so they decided that some of this stuff they were going to parcel out to the victorious parties. Some of it they were simply going to bury and destroy and then resurrect when the time was right, and some they were going to keep to themselves and continue developing after the war, all of which occurred. A similar thing takes place in this ancient cosmic war. And in fact, one of the unique things I bring out in the book, The Cosmic War, is that the victors of that war do precisely what the Allied powers did to Nazi Germany at the end of World War II. They go in, they inventory the vanquished party's technology, they decide which parts of it have to be destroyed, and then which parts of it they want to cart off and use for themselves.
Do you mean they actually destroy technology? That's kind of, wow.
Yeah, the texts indicate very clearly that this was done. But in some cases, the texts also indicate that the technology could not be destroyed. So it was either carted off to places unknown and secreted away, and the other technology that they could use was hauled off and used for other purposes. This is very clear. So we have almost like a paleo-ancient prehistorical version of the technology, you know, the huge technology transfer that occurred from Germany to the post-war Allies, and particularly to the United States and Great Britain after World War II. So I look at this and I speculate, and in part basis on these texts in the Giza Death Star Destroyed and in the Cosmic War, that essentially the same process occurred at the end of this ancient cosmic war. The vanquished took certain steps to preserve as much of their technology as they could, and the victors took certain steps to destroy some aspects of that technology and to preserve other aspects of it. And esotericism, I believe, is the product of these secret societies, are the product of this effort. They were an attempt to preserve the knowledge, number one, on both parties' parts. This is a crucial point to make, and I'll get to the reason why in a moment. Both parties are involved in this process. And at some point, millennia later, those two parties more or less lose sight of which side they were on.
Yeah.
And they begin to kind of overlap and intermingle. This is why we find the moral ambiguity in esoteric traditions concerning these things that we do. I think it's just the natural occurrence over time of what happens. The Templars enter this story in the following way then. Right around, I want to say 430, 435 AD, the last of the great Neoplatonic magicians dies. His name is Iamblichus. And if you read about this man or read his works, he writes things on theurgy and the theology of the gods and so on and so forth. And you read these texts, and they're nothing but standard texts of magic and philosophy and metaphysics. Well, this man dies. Then the Templars pop up. Well, let's go even earlier than the Templars. In Moorish Spain, the Moors, Jewish Kabbalism, and so on and so forth pop up about 3 to 3.5 centuries later. And again, what's unique about this is that we find, once again, the emergence of an esoteric tradition seemingly from nowhere, almost fully fledged. And then the Templars come along in the 12th century, and, you know, under the aegis of Bernard of Clairvaux, they form their order, they have their crusade in the Holy Land, just a few nights. They come back from the Holy Land, fabulously wealthy. Everyone wants to join the order, and it's always been speculated that they found something there by way not only of actual physical treasure, but a treasure of knowledge of some sort. And we can actually date the rise of the Gothic form of architecture occurs right approximately at the same time that the Templar order in Europe begins to coalesce and become quite powerful. And it's always been speculated by esoteric scholars that there has to be some sort of connection, and I think that there is. So what I'm suggesting here is that we have a gap of about 350 years in terms of esoteric history within the West between the death of Iamblichus, who's the last of the great pagan magician philosophers, and the rise of modern Western esotericism in the form of Jewish Kabbalism, and then the type of esotericism that you see connected with the Templar order. And that gap, I'm suggesting, had to have continued in some underground stream, more or less preserving intact the esoteric tradition as it had developed up to the time of Iamblichus, and then as it reemerged in Moorish Spain and with the Templars much later in France. And the entities that I believe that must have done this had to have been connected with one of three things, possibly and most probably all three. The first would have been the old Roman senatorial families that more or less became the early medieval papal curia, and then thus maintained the archives of the papacy during the early Middle Ages, and therefore would have had access to some of these things, you see what I mean? And then the other entity, I think, that was involved in this kind of underground stream would have to have been some of the very old royal houses of Europe, particularly in Spain, in France, and incidentally in Greece, with a group of people that are well known to people familiar with Greek Christianity, a group of people called the Despacini, which means the brothers or relations of the Lord. And then the other group, the third and final place where I think this underground esoteric stream was probably also preserved would have been in Constantinople, with people that had access to the imperial archives of the Eastern Roman Empire, which again would have been enormously considerable. So I think you've got those three things occurring, because there really is no other good way of explaining why all of these esoteric traditions just kind of suddenly and spontaneously reemerge centuries later, fully formed and more or less without any sort of development. You have to assume in order to make sense of this stuff. And as a result of this, the Templars are the bridge connecting that stream of esotericism then forward to the modern stream that is represented particularly well in secret societies like the Rosicrucians, the Masonic societies in Scotland, because there is a very definite and historically documentable connection between the Templars in France and then the rise of early Masonry in Scotland. So there is a continuous underground stream, and they constitute one of the crucial bridges. That was a long way to go around to answer your question, but there you are.
Well, I've read in some historical accounts that when Napoleon went into Rome, and one of his great things there was the Vatican, what we call the Vatican Library,
right,
at that time. And he allowed Nicholas Flamel, who was considered to be an occultist,
alchemist, very famous alchemist.
Yes, and I have a book by Flamel, a copy from the British Museum. They took all of these texts. That's what they that was a huge prize.
Yes.
And God only knows what was in all the, in the bibliothèque in France.
Right.
I don't think you can even get access to these.
No, you cannot. The Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris is very, very jealous of those texts, and you are correct. That is where they ended up. And since you mentioned Napoleon,
here we go.
You knew that was coming. Napoleon Bonaparte is really one of the most interesting figures, I think, in history.
No fooling.
He certainly was not a stupid man by any stretch of the imagination.
He certainly was a lover.
Yeah. Bonaparte, people don't realize, they think of him as nothing but a warmonger, but, he was a great lawmaker and organizer and everything else that goes with it. His genius, of course, was as a tactician, but he certainly was more than that. But one of the interesting things about him that many people don't know is that there is this fascination that he had with esotericism, and the connections that he had with it were very deep and profound. For example, his foreign minister was Bishop Maurice de Talleyrand. And Talleyrand, in addition to being a Roman Catholic bishop, was also a Freemason. And he also happened to be the foreign minister for the restored Bourbon monarchy after the Bonaparte period. So in other words, this man, you could not get rid of him no matter what you did. The interesting thing about Napoleon, he goes to Rome, as you say, he carts off the archives there, or at least some of the Vatican archives. Pardon me. But the other part of this story is his expedition to Egypt.
Right.
He takes literally something like 35,000 French soldiers, hundreds of scientists and scholars and linguists and anthropologists and archaeologists to Egypt. Yeah. Now, just militarily, on the face of it, if you examine what this guy is doing here, it's just absurd. There is no real good geopolitical reason for revolutionary France, and at this time Napoleon is not in charge. He's just kind of a powerful figure within France. It's stabilizing, but it's not yet the period of his first consulate, and he's certainly not yet Emperor of the French. So, he takes a large French fleet, a sizable military and scientific expedition to Egypt. And the military result of this is a foregone conclusion. With British control of the seas, this is not something that France is going to be able to sustain.
Right.
And Bonaparte knows it. So there is another reason for the expedition altogether, and it's precisely here, I think, that we have to look at the esoteric agenda. Because it is due to this expedition that the French discovered the Rosetta Stone, that Champollion was therefore able to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. It is due to this expedition that modern man has his first real good scientific look and examination of Egyptian texts, of Egyptian monuments and artifacts, and so on and so forth. So there was an agenda at work, and I suspect, and I suggest this very strongly in the Giza Death Star deployed, that the real control, the real entity guiding and steering that expedition was precisely the Masonic lodges of France. In other words, that the whole thing was intended from the get-go as an attempt to recover more of this lost knowledge. And I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, that this expedition occurred after his sacking of the archives at Rome. So in other words, the two events may be tied together. They may have discovered something in those archives that convinced them that they had to go back to Egypt and find out as much more as they could.
It's fascinating, and especially when you can weave these things together, because they can be woven together.
Yes, that's precisely true.
It is a matter of connecting these dots.
Right.
Oh, boy. Well, earlier you mentioned a gate or a door.
Right.
Well, if we go back to the Tower of Babel,
Mm-hmm.
Babel is God's gate.
Right.
There are numerous instances in Scripture where Bab is used in a person's name.
Right.
And I'm wondering, a child of Bab.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that mean? A child that came through the gate?
Mm-hmm.
It just there's I don't know.
Well, there's two things I want to address in that respect. The first is that there is a school in alternative research that is kind of pursuing a similar line as I am, in that they're looking at these texts and concluding that these gates, these persistent allusions to doors and gateways of the gods and so on and so forth, were allusions to technology of some sort. And I don't discount that, but I do have this observation to make about that school. None of them really seem to be delving very deeply into plausible modern scientific explanations for it. So I tend to be rather skeptical of what I have seen thus far. But that being said, the physics that I'm talking about in terms of its weaponization could be used in some sort, and I mention this very clearly in the Cosmic War, could also be used in the sense or for the purpose of communication, for rapid communication between widely separated worlds in the cosmos. So that is one possible explanation for this gate idea, so I don't discount it entirely. Now, the other comment I want to make about this is that, going back to the Nazi Bell project for a moment, one of the most interesting things that I discovered when I was researching that project, and it still just kind of creeps me out, I have no good explanation for it, is the fact that the popular thriller novelist Dean Koontz wrote a book, a novel, many years prior to the emergence of the story of the Bell. The novel is called Lightning, and in it, the novel is all about how the Nazis had built a time machine.
Yes.
And the time machine, paradoxically, consists of this large rotating cylinder, which is somehow pulsed with just enormous amounts of electrostatics in the millions and millions of volts. And they're able to use this rotating cylinder as a kind of a gateway or a door to travel around in time. Well, it just so happens that his description of this device is very similar to the actual Nazi Bell and what we know about that device from the documents. And unusually, as I mentioned before, one of its names is Project Kronos. Well, I did an interview, I think it was about 6 to 8 months ago, with Whitley Strieber and Jim Mars. And I mentioned this to them. And Whitley Strieber made the very interesting observation during the interview, as I mentioned this, that he had experienced many similar types of things when he was writing his novels. He'd get an idea, and then, lo and behold, a few years later, out would pop somebody else actually doing it.
Yes, yes.
And he wrote it off, or described it, rather, or explained it as an example or a manifestation of the unusual characteristics of the physics of consciousness. So we're back to that again.
Yeah.
And I tend to give his explanation a lot of credence for this reason. And once again, I go back to these texts that I mentioned in the Cosmic War, because in those texts, again, it's very clear that this technology seems to work better when these gods are either in close physical proximity to it or in actual physical contact with it somehow. And that, to me, implies some connection to consciousness. It's very clear from the text that these technologies are being used to manipulate emotions. So, there's just all sorts of interesting little rivulets and tributaries to all of this ancient physics and modern physics and texts and so on that they're just endlessly fascinating. And the interesting thing, like you say, is that they all seem to connect.
Well, yeah. And I've wondered, I really have, my gosh, Joseph, I mean, there are, in the last few years, such an escalation in women drowning their children.
Yeah.
Men coming home and killing their family, then blowing their brains out.
Right.
And what I've wondered is if they are trying to, in some way, or have miniaturized this technology to the point where they are traveling around experimenting with it on people.
Well, let's pursue the hypothetical here. From what I have read in this area of physics, particularly in the papers of Tom Bearden, we know for a fact that the Soviet Union experimented with some of these types of devices on U.S. embassy personnel, particularly during the late 60s and 70s, during the Brezhnev era, on U.S. embassy personnel in the induction of diseases. And to extend this further, we know for a fact that the Soviet Union devoted a lot of its secret weapons projects budget to the development of the means of the electromagnetic modification and stimulation of certain emotions. So if this technology could be miniaturized to the point, as you're suggesting, of making it mobile, then I don't find it at all implausible that somebody somewhere might be testing it on witless and unknowing victims and perpetrating these horrible crimes, and in which case this makes the husband that comes home and shoots his wife and kids and then shoots himself, it makes them all the victims and none of them the perpetrators, and whoever is doing this horrendous stuff, to me the biggest clue about this is that this is a clue into the ideology that's driving them. And I cannot look at it as anything other than a kind of a resurgence of Nazism in some form that would look at other human beings as somehow less than human, and therefore we can do whatever we wish with them. It's the New World Order mentality, so to speak.
Yes. Well, I've certainly wondered about that because in so many cases, there was nothing apparently wrong in the family.
Right.
The husband had a decent job.
Right.
Everybody that knew him, had nice things to say about
right.
it.
Right. The pattern is always of someone who is psychologically stable, balanced. There is no real good reason or explanation for this sudden, completely irrational and immoral behavior. And when the pattern is repeated over and over again in so many disparate places under such similar circumstances, you do have to wonder. And, to kind of extrapolate it once again from your hypothesis, there is a plausible scientific basis in this type of weaponry for explaining some of these incidents.
That's scary.
Very.
That is scary.
Very.
Well, look at all these reports of birds falling straight out of the sky.
Right.
Look at all these planes, airplanes, small craft, small airplanes that just suddenly disappear, fall out of the sky.
Right.
I'm very suspicious. In talking about this kind of technology, you remember the Philadelphia experiment.
Yes.
You make a ship disappear and reappear, and men caught in the middle of field decks, and a terrible experiment.
Yes.
Deadly. But, I don't think that they have quit trying to perfect that.
Well, you just opened a big Pandora's box.
Uh-huh.
Yes, you did. It just so happens that the book that is at my publisher now is about the Philadelphia experiment and about the Nazi bell. It won't be out until next spring, so I'm going to kind of dance around this a little bit without giving away too much about what's in the book.
Okay.
But one of the things that I conclude on the basis of examining all the available evidence once again from the story, and in fact, what I do in the book is I reproduce things that even William Moore and Charles Berlitz in their famous book about the experiment, they mention, but they don't reproduce. I reproduce these texts and, again, examine them very carefully and at great length. And I've uncovered some new things that, again, to my mind, satisfactorily make a prima facie case that the experiment was indeed performed. But the goal of the experiment, I came to an interesting conclusion. The goal of the experiment was never optical invisibility. Much less did they anticipate that it would have the kind of physiological effects that have been described. People suddenly and spontaneously bursting into flames when exposed to weak magnetic fields, or for no good reason just disappearing right in front of people, and so on and so forth. One of the things that I discovered in researching the experiment, and incidentally, the scientists who have attempted proof-of-concept experiments in order precisely to prove that there was a basis for the Philadelphia experiment. Believe it or not, that's actually been done, and there are serious scientific papers by serious scientific people on it. But I concluded that what they were aiming at was a kind of a radar refraction, and that for some reason, when the experiment was scaled up, in any scientific project, there would have been proof-of-concept experiments at a small scale, and then it would have, had those been successful, as apparently they were, then they would have gone to a full-scale version of it. So it's during this full-scale version that they ran into some unanticipated nonlinear effects that were due to whatever causes. And one of the interesting things I found was that when you examine all of the texts that originally broke the story, in other words, the letters of Carlos Miguel Allende, the thing that even Berlitz and Moore in their book really kind of missed was that Allende insisted that the experiment was performed at sea. In other words, it wasn't in a dockyard. That would have been some prior proof-of-concept experiment. But the full-scale thing was performed at sea. And it's at this point that the experiment ran away. Interestingly enough, when the experiment was performed at sea, it was performed very close to the Bermuda Triangle.
Yes.
And, this was kind of a bolt out of the blue for me, and I thought, oh, you got to be kidding me. Because I've never been, terribly fascinated with stories about the Bermuda Triangle or any of that. But then, I started investigating this stuff. And one of the things that emerges from it and from my research is that if we go back to what Allende says was the basis, the theoretical scientific basis of the experiment, namely Einstein's unified field theory, well, I got digging into that, and I had known enough that Einstein came out with several different versions of his theory, during the last part of his life. He kept modifying and tinkering with it. But the very earliest, more or less full version of the theory dates from a paper that he wrote in 1928, in which he incorporates a mathematical expression called the torsion tensor. And I mentioned this in the last session that we had. The torsion tensor does something that would be analogous to if we were to take a soda can, that was empty and hold it between our hands and then wring it like a dish rag. That's what torsion does. It folds and pleats the medium and it spirals it. So I thought, well, gee, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because that would be precisely the kind of physics that some of these very strange, peculiar results of the Philadelphia experiment could be explained upon. And then I realized something else, that in Einstein's unified field theories, he does a second significant thing. He abandons his so-called equivalence principle, and let me explain what that is. In general relativity, Einstein makes the assumption that inertial mass and gravitational mass, or inertial acceleration and gravitational acceleration, depending on how you look at it, are one and the same thing. And the second corollary with this assumption is that in dealing with the geometry of gravity at the very large scale, he is not assuming, therefore, any, or even kind of admitting the possibility of any localized variation of that. But in his 1928 unified field theory paper, all of that goes out the window. So in other words, he's admitted with his speculations there. One of the things that falls out as an implication of what he writes in that paper is that a local manipulation of the fabric of space-time is possible, and therefore there can be local anomalous regions of electromagnetic or gravitational aberration. Precisely, in other words, as one tends to think of the Bermuda Triangle and some of the strange events that occur in it. So in other words, I thought, gee, this is this is all very, very intriguing, So it kind of, putting all of this together, it kind of provides a plausible speculative rationalization for what we have been told actually occurred with the Philadelphia experiment. Now, the second part of your observation that I want to address is this. You mentioned that somebody somewhere has to keep tinkering with this, or had to have been kept tinkering with this. One of the things that I bring out in this new book that's coming out is that it's very unusual that the Navy, when all of this begins to resurface after the war, particularly in the case of Dr. Morris Jessup, when all of this begins to resurface, the Navy acts in a very peculiar way, as if it either had not heard of the experiment or was wondering what happened to it. That's the only two ways of really reading some of the reactions that you read about in the text that I reproduce in this new book.
Well, the Navy in itself is it's a very interesting topic.
Oh, well, yes. But my point here is that they're acting almost as if they lost the project or lost control of it.
Fascinating.
And, I go back in this new book and I point out that some very unusual things begin to happen when people start snooping in certain areas of the National Archives for anything that tends to corroborate this particular experiment. And one of the things I ran across is that some of the logbooks of the ships that we know from the story of the Philadelphia experiment that were involved with this went missing. And the agency that they went missing to was, believe it or not, the Coast Guard.
Oh, dear.
And I thought, gee whiz, what a nice, out-in-the-open, logical place to hide something like this.
Yeah.
No one would ever think of looking there. And, it's just, to me, it just is a fascinating story because it seems to suggest that somebody somewhere certainly continued investigating this stuff. But the Navy's reaction that people have puzzled over and said, oh, they're just covering it up. The Navy's reaction may, in fact, be genuine. They may literally have lost control of that experiment, and it went somewhere else in this Black Project's labyrinth that this country has. And the other peculiar thing that I found out about the relationships, the constellation of relationships that spin out from the Philadelphia experiment that I mentioned in this new book, is guess who tends to show up precisely in the circle of people that first become involved with the story in the Navy after the war. Guess who? Dr. Werner von Braun.
Oh, my goodness. Whoa.
Yeah, now, if you put that together with everything else I've written about the Nazis, about, in Reich of the Black Sun and SS Brotherhood of the Bell, the fact that the Magic 12 documents indicate very clearly that the paperclip scientists were brought in to look at this Roswell wreckage. Well, now, why are we bringing a bunch of Nazis in to look at this stuff if we think it's extraterrestrial?
Yeah, and how come, now this brings up something else. Holloman Air Force Base.
Mm-hmm.
That's...
how come we have the German Luftwaffe based over here?
Yeah, and then, everybody... Yeah, and everybody talks about White Sands. Well,
right.
White Sands is a testing range. However, on the drive between the White Sands base out there and Holloman, you have a very interesting facility, very low-key. It looks like a shack, but it is called HELSTAF, High Energy Laser Project.
Oh, boy.
And there's a lot of strange things that go on out there.
Oh, yes. I don't doubt it. Well, you mentioned Holloman, and I've just got a comment about that because one day in the 1990s, this was still back when I lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and on Memorial Drive in Tulsa, right up towards Tulsa International Airport, there's this big, huge, Walmart supercenter. And I had gone in there one afternoon to buy something. I forget what it was. I think this was like 1997 or 98. And I came out of the store carrying my bags, and, everybody's in the parking lot, and we hear these jets flying into the airport, and from the sound of the engine, they're very clearly military jets. So, like everybody else, I look up. And I think to a man, everybody in that parking lot that was watching these jets fly in had their jaw just literally hit the ground. Because we looked up, and there were two West German Eurofighters flying into Tulsa International, with the Iron Cross boldly emblazoned on the wings, And you talk about getting a creepy sensation, it's like they're back.
They're back, yeah. Oh, my gosh. Oh. Well, let's cut it here, Joseph, and we will schedule another one. And I'd like the next file, I want to get into Roswell, MJ-12,
okay,
and how this all, Red Mercury.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. And, we've got to be looking at how many generations of weapons that we're looking at here.
Oh, yes, yes.
Because they've been working hard to perfect their death machine.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And, it's sort of an elegant thing because nobody really knows where to point the finger.
Yes.
But give out your information.
Sure.
Please.
If your listeners want to get the books, there's 6 currently available. They are the Giza Death Star, the Giza Death Star Deployed, the Giza Death Star Destroyed, Reich of the Black Sun, SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and the Cosmic War. They are all $16.95 each, with the exception of the Cosmic War. That's $18.95. And my desire or preference for your listeners is that they would order them from Barnes & Noble or Borders or directly from the publisher and avoid certain large internet companies that ship our jobs overseas.
That's right.
The publisher is Adventures Unlimited Press, And they can be contacted at 1-800-718-4514 or online at www.adventuresunlimitedpress. That's all one word. It's all lowercase. adventuresunlimitedpress.com.
And give out that phone number for them again.
Sure. It's 1-800-718-4514. I should stress that if they order directly with the publisher, there is a discount of 10% on orders of 3 or more books.
Well, that's good. And when people call over there, say hi to Jerry.
Yes, say hi to Jerry.
Yeah, I just love him. He is such a good guy.
Yeah, he is.
And we'll have him on again, too. He's a good author also.
Yes, he is. Very good.
We've had him on several times, and really very enjoyable. But, Joseph, this is, I'll tell you, folks, if you don't get these books, you are missing out on what will be classics. These books are very important, and they're going to spawn a lot of thought in people. So they're very important books. Joseph, you have really and truly taken a dagger at the heart of the situation.
Well, I hope so.
You have. And God bless you for it.
Well, thank you.
And God bless everybody out there with ears to hear, because I hope and pray that you will get these books and get them in your hands, all of them. And as you said, Joseph, your new one will be out when?
I believe it's going to be out in the spring. The reason I say that is that my publisher sent me the cover artwork about 2 to 3 weeks ago, seeing if I liked it or not, and that usually means he's planning to put it in the next catalog, so that's my guess.
Great. Okay, folks, this wraps up Part 4 of Cosmic War with Joseph P. Farrell, and you can email him at V as in Victor, Vardas, V-A-R-D-A-S, put the number 3 at AOL.com. His website is GizaDeathStar.com. And get your hands on these books, all of them. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes with Joseph Farrell signing off tonight. This is the end of Part 4, and we will be back, God willing. Good night, everybody, and God bless you.
The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com. Follow us on Twitter at The Byte Show.